Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to everyone on the webinar as well. My name is George Constantine. I am the chair of the Nonprofit Organizations Practice Group here at Venable, and we are talking today about governance, and that's our title of our program, Talking About Governance, Practical and Legal Tips for Effective Management of Boards and Committees. Before I get into introducing my colleague and friend Mike Curtin, I just wanted to have a couple of words, particularly for those who aren't here in person. The name of the room that we're broadcasting from is our Civiletti room here at Venable's DC offices. And it's named after Ben Civiletti. Ben Civiletti is a leader, a longtime leader of our firm, actually joined the firm in 1964 as an associate and became a brilliant lawyer and leader here at the firm, but also one important part of his resume, he's a former Attorney General of the United States under the Carter administration in the late 70s. Ben sadly passed away on Sunday, so I just wanted to just take a moment and recognize the sort of the namesake of the room and point out one of the many pieces of his legacy that I think is near and dear to our hearts here in the Nonprofit Organizations Practice Group. Is he founded the Venable Foundation, which is has become a very large law firm foundation that funds, local charities where all our offices are located, and really looking to help charities that are doing great on the ground work to improve our communities. And he was not only the founder of it, but a champion of it throughout his tenure with the firm as chairman, and made sure that in particular the partners were consistent and substantial contributors to the foundation. So I just wanted to sort of take a moment and observe that.
George, I just remembered as you were telling that story, it was probably not long after I had started, Ben. It was probably 2006 or something, and I was down at the kitchen. And for those of you who don't know, DC Central Kitchen, right, currently now is located in the basement of one of the largest homeless shelters in the country, not too far from here on Capitol Hill. And when you imagine the basement of one of the largest homeless shelters in the kitchen in the country, all of those glorious kinds of images that you're thinking about are true. It is not a terribly welcoming place. And Ben, I'll never forget him I went outside to meet him, and he's walking down what we lovingly call a driveway, which is more of an alley. And he had on, of course, a very nattily dressed with the bow tie, and cut quite a figure coming down that alley, and then brought him into the kitchen, and he walked around, and he couldn't have been nicer with everyone. But it was just such a stark image. It was just wonderful to have him there. And of course, I've known him for his work for so long. So I appreciate you saying that.
Great. Yeah, no, and he's also the founder of this DC office, and now it's become our largest office. So just wanted to say that. I want to briefly introduce Mike, my co-panelist here. You're in for a treat, because usually when we have these programs, it's often multiple lawyers on the stage. Now you only have to deal with one. Mike is a longtime CEO of DC Central Kitchen, and has an interesting background in his personal career. He started out, I didn't realize you had a degree in religion is what you graduated with, which is always a lucrative path, right? Went to get involved in the hospitality industry and worked for restaurants, was a bartender, owned a restaurant here locally for a while, and then sort of started his career in DC Central Kitchen back in 2004, if I recall. And Mike can tell you a lot more about the kitchen, and then sort of weave in what we want to talk about today, a lot of these governance tips that Mike has learned over the years. And I'll share some of the things that I've learned working with a lot of other different types of nonprofit organizations. So we're on the agenda here. The introductions are just about over, and then we'll turn over to Mike, and he can talk a little bit about his experiences. And just like you can't get to your dessert before you eat your vegetables, we're gonna have to talk about the legal issues for a while, and then we'll get to what we think are some important tips for good governance. And appreciate an opportunity to hear from you if there are any questions, particularly if you have any that are online. We'll be able to get to those after the program. So with that, make sure I've got everything I wanted to say. Yeah, let's turn it over to Mike and hear a little bit about DC Central Kitchen. Tell us about your story, and tell us about the governance in particular.
Okay, great. Well, great to see everyone here and everyone online. Thank you all for joining. So I should say, I've tended bar a lot, but the funnest place I attended bar was in Japan, when I lived there for several years after college, and that was a great experience, and ultimately how I got into the whole hospitality sector. And it started here in Washington, D.C. at the Hay Adams Hotel right across from the White House. And that's where I first met Ben, because he used to lunch at the Hay Adams quite often. And so I did, but there's all these things come back to connect. So real quickly, DC Central Kitchen, a tagline we use when we talk about ourselves these days is to say, we fight hunger differently. And I think we also may look at boards differently. I think we like to think of ourselves as doing things differently just because we like to do things differently. And when we talk about fighting hunger differently, we do that because we don't use food in the way that many hunger fighting organizations typically do. Actually, the kitchen is based on two principles. One is that food will never end hunger. We will never be able to feed our way out of hunger. We have to get individuals to a place of economic self-sufficiency and sustainability so we can really eliminate all these anti-hunger programs handing out food. We'll just never get to that place. And it's odd that we do that given that kitchen is in our name and we produce, serve and deliver 10,000 meals a day. But really, in many ways, that just proves the point that food won't end hunger. If we can put that kind of volume into the community and still have hunger, still in this city, Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, 36% of our population are food insecure. Washington, D.C. has the largest population of seniors, percentage of seniors in America that are food insecure. That's criminal. And so our work has really always focused on training. We'll talk about that in a second. But the other principle to get to that training place is that our founder years ago went on a sort of a frustrating, confusing, unsatisfying volunteer experience giving out food to men and women living on the streets here in DC. And he realized through various exchanges that evening that somehow accidentally, because folks that are out in the world helping their neighbors with food and clothing and these material needs are doing it with love in their hearts and the best of intentions. But somehow this notion of charity had been sort of twisted so that there was a lot of emphasis on the redemption of the giver and not enough emphasis on the liberation of the receiver. And so the kitchen is all about that liberation, using food as a tool to get there. So that's why our work is about training individuals that have faced significant barriers to employment, like histories of incarceration, addiction, abuse, trafficking, homelessness, or other traumas, for jobs in the hospitality industry, so they can start a career and live that life, that be the people they want to be, like we are all searching for. So with that in mind, as I said, we've focused on training, and over the years have expanded our work really from a more traditional, but I think innovative social service organization doing feeding and some training to a social enterprise economic development organization that is really focused on creating innovative solutions to systemic failures in our community and our country. And the way that manifests itself at DC Central Kitchen is a large portfolio of food-based social enterprises. A lot of the meals, the community meals that we serve does provide a revenue stream. We have one of the country's most recognized and awarded farm to school programs. We serve breakfast, lunch, and dinner, snack, and supper in 19 DC schools, about 6,000 meals a day. That's a contract that earns about $6 million in revenue a year for the kitchen. But also it creates a lot of jobs for the individuals that graduate from our program. We run 2 social enterprise cafes. We run a wholesale business of fresh fruits and vegetables, cut fruits and vegetables that we wholesale to corner stores in the city's food apartheid areas, and do a whole host of other businesses, again, that generate revenue and create opportunities for the folks that come through our program. So our board really has to contend with that and contend with our evolution and growth over the years. So as George said, I did join DC Central Kitchen in 2004. I've been there 18 years as of last Tuesday. We are at a place now where our board needs to be a very different kind of board than it did when I started. When I started, we had I think we were 32. I was a 32nd employee at DC Central Kitchen, and we had a budget of $2.5 million. We now have close to 200 employees, and this year's budget is $27 million. So a very wildly different place with wildly different needs and considerations. And so these are the kinds of things that our board has had to become and to think about, as opposed to an organization that's just starting out and really sort of finding its way. So that's a bit background. Now, structure. Should I move on to okay. All right. I get nervous. George, like, he's always trying to cut me off or something. I know. So as I said, we like to think of things differently, and I think we do think of boards a little differently. I'm pleased to hear, as we were discussing this, George is telling me that there are a few other voices now in the community that may be thinking somewhat like we do or I do, but we'll talk about that. So there are two things in my mind that a board needs to do. There's governance and support. And a lot of this will be in some of the materials that are there. There's something we have called our guiding principles, and that lists a lot. So as you read that afterwards, you'll see a lot of the stuff that I've talked about here. But under those headings of governance and support, there are three things that I believe a board really should do. The first is they need to be responsible, involved in fiscal oversight and sustainability. And that has two pieces. One is they need to make sure I'm not stealing. The CFO isn't stealing, that the money is coming in appropriately and it's going out appropriately, that we are being true to the wishes and desires of our donors, that we have a third party audit every year, that there is a committee of the board that meets on a regular basis with myself and the CFO to go over the financials, and they can represent to the board that everything is being done above board, and our finances are where they say we are, and they are a true representation of the work we are doing. The other piece, I believe, of financial sustainability is that board members need to have some skin in the game. We are not a typical, or you do have to contribute to be on our board, but it's not a give or get. It's sort of a give or get, but it's like it's $25,000. Here you are to sit on this arts board or a hospital board or some academic institutions. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's just not what we want to be. And we want to make sure, and we'll talk about this later, that we maintain a wildly diverse set of voices on our board. And so to set a single dollar amount for every seat just wouldn't make sense. But
the funders, I seem to recall the funders will often ask what percentage of the board give to the.
Well, actually, the way they ask it is do 100% of the board give.
So these are like private foundations.
Private foundations, more and more are asking. Even we've seen some government grants now, and it's also a question on the 990. And so it's really, really important that we can answer that question honestly, truth, and say yes. To what degree is not of import hasn't been to any foundation or funder that we've spoken with yet, but the percentage is very important. What we do is we say we want this to be a gift of personal significance, and we want it to be in the top 3 of your philanthropic donations while you sit on our board. So whatever your other focus is, whether it's your high school, your college, your kids' soccer team, whatever it is, we want to be in the top 3. And we have access to software where we can really sort of go do a dive and say, this is what, and we do sit down every year with every board member and discuss their priorities, how they want to be involved in the programming aspect of the kitchen, events, and then financially. And so we set a number, but it's different for every person every year, and especially if, like right now, we're going through a campaign. So we've asked them to be involved in that. Second, I believe, is mission integrity. So that's to make sure that we are not, the overused term is mission creep. We're not going too far outside of our lane where we shouldn't be. That does not mean that they say yes or no to new programmatic initiatives or areas into which we want to go. And I think, especially at the kitchen, I know that you can look at many of the things that we have done over the years. And as the first time we introduced these, there was a lot of like, whoa, that's not who we are. And then we have to work through it, and that's fine, because that iterative process is actually quite helpful often to make sure that when we get to the end of where we think we want to be, we can actually draw that straight line to what we're doing now and our mission. And even though now, 33 years after Robert Egger founded DC Central Kitchen, we're doing crazy stuff, that was never imagined as part of what we were going to do then. But I believe you can draw a straight line to that original mission and intent of using food as a tool to strengthen bodies, empower minds, and build communities. And then the third is to hire, support, and if necessary, fire and rehire the chief executive. So it is absolutely, I believe, the purview of the board to hire my role, but it's also absolutely the purview of the board to make sure that I have all the tools that I need as to do that job. And ultimately, if I'm not or can't, then it's their job to terminate that relationship and start again. So those are the three in my book. You will notice, I hope, that none of those three says anything about setting, determining, guiding the strategic mission or activities of the organization. I firmly believe that it is an absurd proposition, an unfair burden to put on a board member who would maybe loves the organization, deeply involved, committed, all of those things, volunteers, comes to 3, 4, maybe 6, however many meetings a year, to think that they somehow would have a better sense of what the strategic progress, vision, roadmap of an organization should be better than someone who has been involved in, lives, breathes that organization, the work that's happening, the individuals and groups that this organization works with on a regular basis. It just doesn't seem appropriate. And I think, unfortunately, what I've seen in a lot of the literature, if you will, that setting the strategic vision of the organization is usually the #1 job. And I just couldn't disagree more. I was pleased to say that George told me, maybe not in a conference, but in the post-conference barroom reception, there are people that are saying those things now.
There's starting to be some chinks in the armor of that orthodoxy, but we'll see.
That's just what I believe. But a lot of people still have this idea that that's what a board is supposed to be. And that's why I think it is wildly important to be very upfront with board members. It doesn't mean that there aren't organizations or times, maybe even in our organization, that board members needed to be more directly involved in strategy, and that would have been important. But I would never want to mislead a board member to think that that's what they are going to do, and that's how they're going to be engaged. That's just not appropriate. So that's what that was really the force, the guiding force behind our guiding principles, is to make sure that everyone knew what they were signing up for before they signed up for it. If we wanted to talk, lessons learned would actually be probably my funnest thing to talk about for hours. But that's when you get yourselves in trouble if people join the board and thinking that they're going to be doing something that you don't want them to do or that they shouldn't be doing, and that's when you're just setting yourself up for failures. Committees. I'm just going to hit this one really quick because. And all this is going to be tied into structure in this relationship, but we don't overcommittee ourselves. I don't believe in committees for the sake of committees. We have an executive committee and a finance committee. And actually, before I go any further, I should say that even though George is my counsel, anything that I say should not be construed as legal advice, or that George even agrees with what I'm saying. Right? So
I meant to say that at the start.
So George has helped me. He's pulled me back from the edge a couple of times, and as actually his counsel has been wildly helpful as we developed our bylaws and redeveloped our bylaws and our approach to doing that. And one of the things in when we redid the bylaws is we did them in a minimalist kind of way. So we just said there will be an executive committee and a finance committee. We have had other committees, but we're not required to do them. The executive committee exists to act when the board cannot in a timely fashion. And the finance committee, as I said, I believe is a really important standing committee to have as an ongoing. But ultimately, for me, the board as volunteers and as committee members are meant to be consultative and supportive. And we tell board members, I may be wanting to talk to you every day for a month about something specific in your area of expertise, and I may not talk to you for another 9 months after that. And that's, people are just going to have to be happy with that relationship, and they can continue to be involved and come to events and do other things and engage with our students. But the board it's an up and down, it's a cyclical kind of process. So that relationship is very important. Again, upfront, I think when we talk later about challenges that we face with boards, to me, it all comes back to relationships and creating expectations and being clear about that, and making sure that there's a significant level of trust. If there is a combative relationship between a board chair and an chief executive, I mean, that is just a recipe for disaster. And I've had that. That is probably one of the most important and formative lessons that I have learned, is that there has to be that really powerful, close, honest relationship of trust between the executive and the board chair, and then the rest of the board is going to see that and follow suit. And if the board chair can really represent the organization's needs as defined really by the chief executive, you're going to be in a really good space. We're going to have something that our quarterly board meeting is next Tuesday, and we're going to vote on something that we've never ever done before at DC Central Kitchen, and it's a compensation issue, and it could have had the potential to be very I don't know, contentious maybe is the word. Or there could have been a lot of different viewpoints, and there still may. I'm not sure. The vote hasn't happened yet, but because I started this conversation with the chair 3 months ago and worked through a lot of iterations, brought in the treasurer. They are fully on board. We just had a joint meeting with the finance committee and the executive committee. Everyone is completely on board. And I imagine that the meeting will go incredibly smoothly in the vote. The executive session that we have scheduled for 30 minutes, maybe 5, I'd like to think. But if there had been a different relationship between me and the chair, I probably wouldn't have even had the comfort level to introduce this idea in the first place. And that's a really bad place to be. So let me just tell you the other lesson quickly is the bylaws. So when I started, I have to admit, I was incredibly naive coming into the nonprofit sector. Although I will say, when that was my first time theoretically, but owning my own restaurant for 4 years was really my first time in the nonprofit sector. But for real, and as recognized by the IRS, this is my first time. And I just assume that everyone who's going to be on a board is doing it for the right reason, and they want to do the best thing, and it's really for the good of the organization, and it would never be about personal aggrandizement or I want to look better in front of my friends or whatever it is. And boy, was I wrong. We had George will remember, some really contentious times when our founder, it was just before he was transitioning, during the transition, and after he transitioned out. Really, really bad. And during that time is when I think we rewrote the bylaws. And the biggest thing that we did after I joined and Venable became our council, and changing the bylaws was making sure there were term limits. There weren't term limits before when I got there, and that was the heart of all of these problems. Was really allowing people to think that they were calling the shots. They would be there forever, and I served them, and we as a group weren't serving the community and the people, and that was a crazy thing. The last couple of things. Last thing I want to say about the lessons is that I've seen that for whatever reason, people walk into a boardroom, they turn off a part of their brain that helps them navigate the rest of the world and their real life, whether it's finances or just hiring, firing, whatever it is, and they turn on a part of the brain that they think should be on as a board member. And oftentimes that part of the brain is the part of my brain that says no, or the part of my brain that just wants to be more creative or thoughtful. But I sort of have to dumb myself down when I'm working with these poor people doing this nonprofit work, and they're lucky to have my big business brain here come to the boardroom and explain to them the way things really should be, and that's really unfortunate. And so again, that's part of the conversation that really has to be had. And this notion of no, I'll tell this story. When I was starting at DC Central Kitchen, part of the process was an interview with the board chair and I think one or two other board members. And the first thing that they said to me was, and I remember our founder's name was Robert Egger, very visionary, innovative, just go it alone kind of guy, and didn't have a whole lot of time for boards. And they said to me, well, you realize the most important part of your job is going to be saying no to Robert. And I said to myself, that's probably the stupidest thing I've ever heard anyone say. Here's this guy who founded this organization that is literally changing the way we think about hunger around the world, and wants to do these innovative things that are outside of the box and different. And that's precisely why this model works. And they were hiring me to say no. And I just said, I don't think that that's the job I can do. And we are able to work through that, but still, there's, I think, a large part of the board mentality that says, well, we can't take any risks. We just can't. And that's just wrong. We have to take risks, or we're not going to be able to meet the needs as they evolve and grow. And so all of those then led us to create that document, the guiding principles that we can delve into more as we go. And I'm also, after this, always happy to talk with folks about that.
Great. That's a tremendous background. Good. And Mike, I mean, so much what we're going to talk about will sort of bring back in a lot of, particularly the lessons that you described. From the board member's perspective, oftentimes just as your last lesson, I think they're probably thinking, well, I'm not getting paid for this. I'm here to, help, whatever I can. Why would I put myself at risk? So you have to sort of have that trust level, sure, that comfort level that these decisions, while they may seem to be a bit aggressive or unique or different, are not necessarily putting the board members at risk. So with that introduction or discussion from Mike about how DC Central Kitchen works and particularly its governance, I'm going to go over some of the legal basics and what are the sort of the legal aspects of governance, because you're limited as executives of nonprofit organizations as to what you can do in governance by these legal underpinnings. That's why I think it's important to go over it. I won't spend a heck of a lot of time on it because I think we would benefit more from the discussion towards the end about some of the pointers on addressing things on how to have an effective governance structure that's going to work for your organization. And Mike's a unique organization in so many ways, and maybe there's some takeaways from a lot of you who are here or on the call. But there are also other types of organizations that are represented too, particularly those like membership groups, associations, and those sorts of groups that have their own unique challenges. So I'll go over the legal side here pretty quickly. Really what sort of sets the guardrails or sort of puts the parameters around what you can do as an organization through governance is through the statute, the nonprofit corporation statute for the state in which you're incorporated. It's the most important, sort of the highest level of authority that you have to look to on governance. There is some tax exemption tax issues that go along with that too at the federal levels. If you're 501c3 or 501c6, it doesn't dictate, those sections of the tax code don't really dictate what your governance should be like, but the restrictions that are there really sort of point you in certain directions when it comes to how you are run as an organization. So a lot of times from an executive perspective, you're looking at the bylaws and you're thinking, oh, these are our rules of the road. We can change these however we want to make it better and make it work for us. But you have to understand that has to be consistent with whatever that particular state statute says about, different things related to, what the minimum size of a board should be, what the type of notice should look like, or whether you can indemnify directors. There's statutory requirements that are part of that. So your bylaws have to be consistent with that. And there are also, I think a lot of times we'll get these questions that sort of blend the legal and the practical, where a client or a head of an organization will say, does this have to be a board decision, for instance? And you look at the statute and the bylaws, and there isn't very much in the statutes that we work with, the nonprofit corporation statutes that says the board must approve this or that. There are certain specific things like selecting officers of a corporation, approving certain major transactions like merger or dissolution, sale of substantial amounts of assets and those sorts of things, maybe making amendments to your bylaws. Beyond that, the statute doesn't really say the board must approve this, or rather, alternatively, the board can certainly delegate to other officers, staff officers, or board officers. So it's important to sort of understand, when this question is what must be a board decision. It may not be a statutory or even a bylaw thing. It may be sort of based on your own practice and based on your own policies. For membership organizations, a similar question often arises: when must the members vote? And, from a practical perspective, we know if you run a membership organization, you want to avoid member votes to the greatest extent possible. They're challenging to do. You open yourself up for criticism that's usually unfounded about, nefarious motives and those sorts of things. So we really try to limit those member votes to what's absolutely required by the statute or your bylaws. And that's often, in some states, it may mean that the members do get to elect the members of the board. Sometimes statutes are pretty prescriptive about that. But more likely, it's going to be those same sorts of major transactions that I referred to for a board vote. The board and the members have to approve things like merger or dissolution or those substantial transactions. And then when it comes to exempt status, there are certain things, like I said earlier, that will guide you to, okay, well, even though this is not an actual requirement, 501c3, for example, wants to, has restrictions on private interment. If you enter a transaction that's very lucrative to an insider, you're in trouble. You could lose your tax exempt status. Well, there's a process that's in place that's very much advisable from our perspective, that the tax code has put in, that gives you a rebuttable presumption that this transaction you're entering into is actually reasonable. So if you're going to pay a significant amount to a company that's owned by a board member, you want to make sure you go through those steps of the rebuttable presumption process, where you get fair market consideration or valuation of that transaction, and you have it considered by disinterested members of the board and not the person who could benefit from it, and then you document it. So when it comes to must the board do this, or how must we sort of handle our governance on these things, you have to be mindful of and consult with your counsel on things that are required under statute, or maybe required under your own bylaws, or are very much recommended under the tax exempt status. When it comes to your documents, I said it before, I mean, it's sort of like a hierarchy. You've got the corporate law that's sort of at the top of the list when it comes to the most important precedent or document to follow. In addition, under that, you have articles of incorporation. That's the document that a nonprofit corporation submits to the state when it is incorporated. And it's a very brief document. It says, we would like to avail ourselves of the corporate protection that goes with being a corporation in your state, and we agree to abide by your statute, is sort of the deal that you make when you incorporate. Then under the articles of the bylaws. So the articles sort of trump the bylaws if there's inconsistency, but usually if the articles are written properly, there's little chance for that to happen. And then under the bylaws are your policies and procedures. And for good governance, the main thing that most of our organization clients look for is flexibility. Your bylaws generally can be amended through board action if you're a non-membership organization. Usually in most states, if you are a membership organization, a bylaws amendment will require a membership vote as well. So kind of what Mike was talking about with our bylaws revision that we worked on with DC Central Kitchen those many years ago, we try not to have bylaws that tie an organization's hands to certain procedures and practices unnecessarily, when those sorts of things can be put into the policies instead. And I'll go over quickly what some of those things are. So here are the things that I feel almost are must-have for bylaws, and I did that in a pretty detailed list here. So sorry for the small print, but certain things, if you're a membership organization, for a number of reasons, oftentimes the statute requires it, but also just from a perspective of protecting against antitrust and other risks, you want to make sure all your membership qualifications, rights, and categories are in there, and what the process, or not necessarily even the full process, but the right you may have to suspend or terminate members, and also to address the fact that dues may be set and changed. We used to work with an organization that actually had the dues amount in the bylaws, not just the fact that the board can set the dues, but what the dollar amount, and it was written into the bylaws, which every time there needed to be a change in the dues, they would have to go to the members to get the members to approve the change. And the change was almost always a proposed increase, not a decrease. Some of the other things are all here. I mean, they're all pretty straightforward, but it's not a very long list, really, that you necessarily need in your bylaws. You want to take advantage of flexibility that the statutes will provide for bylaws to address certain things. For example, in DC, there are a lot of provisions that says unless provided in the bylaws, your meeting notice must be X, or your quorum must be Y, or something like that. And those defaults are usually taking away the flexibility that you want as an organization. So look to those exceptions that you have in the statute when you work with council on changing your bylaws and creating a more flexible governance structure. Policies, there's a ton of policies. Obviously, those you work with nonprofit organizations or for nonprofit organizations have seen them all. Just the key ones to think about that we don't want to see in the bylaws, but we'll often see as separate policies. And it probably goes without saying, but the reason that we prefer to see these things in policy rather than bylaws is you don't have to go to the members, or you don't have to have a formal bylaws amendment vote with your board to change policies. And there's a certain sort of understood less formality that goes along with something being in a policy as opposed to the bylaws. So conflict of interest, expense reimbursement, et cetera. A lot of these are policies that the Form 990, the IRS asks about in the Form 990, so it is important to have them in place. And now more on sort of on the authority of the organization and the governance of an organization. You know, we sort of joked a little bit, and I think Mike is the tip of the spear on a new approach to governance when it comes to whether the you know, who sets strategy and mission and you know what staff's role is. And I mean, you know, joking aside, it seems that those who work in this space, who consult on this, or have sort of come around to suggesting that maybe professional staff, particularly CEO, who have long time experience within a particular community, industry, or profession, may be, you know, sort of the better people to lead that strategy discussion. But the legal point is the board of directors runs the show. The board of directors, under every nonprofit corporation statute, has the authority to oversee all activities of the organization. You know, and I always say, you know, if they want to say that they want you to paint the mailroom color green, they can do that, and they can dictate it. They can go into the weeds and ask you how much you're paying this or that person, and can by resolution change that compensation. Really bad governance, really not the way anything should go. But we'll occasionally get questions like, can the board do this? Can the board do that? And invariably, almost always the answer is yes. Sometimes it's also with member approval, or sometimes it's, well, if they do this, it's contrary to the tax exemption restrictions. You know, there may be reasons that they shouldn't, but their power and authority as a board is, you know, pretty significant. Now, DC has a concept that some organizations, not many, avail themselves of, that allow the board to set a sort of a separate body, and other statutes have this too. I'm just most familiar with the DC one. Call it a designated body, for instance, where some authority rests with another body. Those of you who are with membership organizations that may have a House of Delegates, that's sort of that concept. Sometimes a House of Delegates may have some authority that otherwise presumptively would be with the board. The members of a membership organization, I talked about sort of their authority already, and where members get the right to vote. It's much less significant than a board would have. Under a board of directors, you can have an executive committee, just as Mike described his. The executive committee is one that's sort of meant to act in between meetings of the board. It has all the authority of the board, some limitations that are built into statute. For instance, executive committees generally aren't allowed to name officers, generally aren't allowed to approve amendments to documents or make approvals on those significant transactions that we talked about, like merger, dissolution, et cetera. There are also other committees of the board, and this is very basic 101, so I'll go quickly, but there's a general concept that certain committees are allowed to bind the corporation, but not all. The executive committee is sort of the quintessential example of a committee that's able to bind the corporation between meetings of the board. There are other types of committees that may also have that authority. Generally, most states will say, in order to be a committee of the board, or a committee that has the authority to bind the organization, you have to be a subset of the board. You can't just have non-board members be part of that committee and have that authority. There are tons of other committees, other bodies that are called committees that are really more sort of advisory in nature. You know, your annual meeting planning committee, or, you know, maybe you've got a task force or a committee for the food fight event or something like that. They can't bind, but they can, you know, give plans and help through the governance process. And from a practical perspective, oftentimes I'll call that sort of the farm system for organizations. If you have leadership that are, you know, a good term limit set up, where you have to sort of keep refreshing that board leadership and getting more, you know, new and fresh faces in. One way to understand, you know, how people operate and how they would work on a board is to see how they do on committees. So those advisory committees are often very helpful for that. Staff and officers do have authority as delegated to them by the board and by the bylaws. So, you know, obviously we can't go to the board with every decision. Otherwise, you know, the board would have to meet a lot more than, you know, 4 times a year. So that the officer authority through you know, the statute and you know, general, you know, concepts of law, there is authority that as an officer, whether you're staff or volunteer, you have that authority. One point I like to say, and we do a lot of orientation discussions with some of our clients on, board roles and authority and things like that. And those of you who are CEOs will know I don't really hype up that whole point that the board can do anything they want. I play that down a little bit. One thing that sometimes you get on the board, you're a director of a board of a nonprofit, and you may not realize this, but solely being a director doesn't give you any real independent authority. A board of directors gets to act because as a whole, as a group. So oftentimes many of you may have already heard this, but you'll want to take action as a board outside of a board meeting and maybe do an email poll or something like that. The board isn't holding any authority outside of that board meeting. Their authority is when they're acting as a board. Generally, an email poll, unless you get unanimous written consent, is not going to be enough to bind the organization. So this concept that an individual director can bind the organization or direct staff or anything like that, it's just not true. There's no real authority there. Now, volunteer officers do have some of that authority, if they're a treasurer or a secretary, those sorts of things, but individual directors do not have it. There's my clip art of something from the board. I don't know what that is, but it was a Creative Commons license. We're not violating it. I said board should only act in meetings, and we talked about this. It's as you see my bullet there. The board is typically viewed as setting the strategy and mission of the organization, but not everyone agrees. So oftentimes this comes out though in a way that I viewed it as almost a way for staff to say, chief staff officers, people in Mike's role to say, stop telling me what I pay the mailroom attendant. Stop telling me what color to paint this room. That's too low for you. That's too much in the weeds for you. You should be doing strategy, mission, higher stuff. The reality is that professional staff are engaged to do a lot of things throughout the year that the board just really has no business getting involved with, even though they may have the authority to do so. And of course, we're not going to go into detail, but Mike had a great, the way he highlighted the sort of the three expectations that he has for members of the board. The first one was oversight, and that's that duty of care, and particularly on the financial side. Duty of care means as a board member, you're supposed to act as a reasonably prudent director would in the same or similar circumstances. The lawyers in the room and on the phone know that's sort of like a negligence standard. Basically, it's kind of rare to see a fiduciary duty of care lawsuit come up, where either donors to a nonprofit or members of the nonprofit see some sort of bad action by board members and actually bring the board members to court over it. But when you do see it, it's always financial. It's always some sort of lack of oversight that caused some embezzlement to happen or some waste of corporate assets. So that oversight's important. Duty of loyalty is a duty to avoid conflict of interest, and duty of obedience is the duty to maintain the mission and consistent with applicable law. Okay, so I kind of ran through that, but I think a lot of that was, so those for CLE, the code is Governance 2022. There we go. So we, I don't think we said this before,
like
but
the prize and the Cracker Jacks.
Yeah,
you have to sit through to get the code.
That's right. That's proof that you attended this event. So we didn't say this, but back in 2014, Mike and I did a similar presentation. Things have changed. We're talking about different things than we did then. We had 10 tips then. We're whittling down to 5 because I think we probably went really over on the last one. But these are key tips for effective governance. So we're just going to go through these and talk a little bit on each of them, and you'll get to hear from Mike a little more than you have these past few slides. And this is probably the biggest one. Look, we do a lot of work with nonprofit organizations and work and talk with CEOs a lot. And one of the biggest challenges these past couple of years that we hear from our CEOs when it comes to their board is creating a new board composition, changing things up a little bit, maybe having some turnover, some change. And a lot of it's diversity, not just, the typical diversity characteristics, but also, what type of set of the industry do you come from, or what profession do you work with? But certainly, a lot of boards, a lot of our nonprofit boards that we all work with, aren't reflective of the community when it comes to either diversity or proper representation, even geographic and those sorts of things. And it's a struggle with so many of our clients, and in particular those that have been around for a while, where some board members, that's a part of their identity. You talk about the term limits and not having them. It's been a challenge, and there's been a lot of efforts to shake things up and get some change in place. And the main thing I would point out with my experience of working with a lot of these organizations is have patience. It's going to take some time. There's a study that BoardSource, the organization, has come out with. It's available on their website. It was really interesting. I looked it over for preparation for today, and a lot of statistics in there. But some of the things that sort of jumped out was that on average, the organization surveyed had 22% of their boards were composed of people of color, whereas the community itself is much more in the sort of the 40% range when it comes, nationally. 38%, only 38% of executives felt the boards represented the community. And I would put community broadly. I mean, it's not just your physical community where you're working in, but also, if it's a professional organization or a trade association, the association you represent. There's clearly sort of objective evidence that boards of nonprofits aren't quite there when it comes to representation, particularly when it comes to diversity characteristics. And so a lot of that is, you've got members of the board who just feel that this is their seat forever. You've got issues that may come with the bylaws, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And sometimes you've got to, sort of overcome opposition from the members. So I don't know, Mike, what have you been able to do, with DC Central Kitchen? I think you're pretty representative of the community.
So I said earlier that we want a wide variety of voices and representation. One of the things that we did bake into our bylaws is require that at least one of our directors be a graduate of our program. So the way our board breaks down now is it's 55% people of color, 64% women, and 10% graduates. So we have 2 graduates. Our board right now is 21 people. That's a little too high. I want to bring it down. I believe, but there were reasons why it's going to take it got as big as it did. I think that it's wildly important, and even as we talked about, that foundations now are asking about 100% board participation financially. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of board foundations and other philanthropists now are very interested in board composition. I think that I don't agree with that as board composition being a determining factor in possibly in certain grants. But it certainly is important to make sure boards are looking at who they are or having sit at the table. For us, the thing that's most important to me is bringing people on a board that are somehow already involved with DC Central Kitchen. They know who we are. They've been a volunteer. They've been a chef as a hiring partner. They've been some other community partner in some way that they've been touched with. They've touched us. They've taken the time to understand who we are and to be part of us. And we have, as we've gotten to know them, we learned that they may have specific talents or access to places, people, or things that we need, or we need some more help and access in terms of hiring, whatever it is. But I am not a fan of the the board consultants. I've had people call me and say, "Hey, I'm a consultant for X and X firm, and we have the perfect board member for you." And I say, I doubt it. If there is the perfect board member, I would probably know. So I just think it's really important to be thoughtful and to dig deep with that in the community and look to, you don't have to find the top people. I'll tell you a quick story. So a friend of mine started a nonprofit back in the mid 90s, and she did what seemed smart, is got all of the big philanthropists, Jim Kimsey, Ted Leonsis, name a couple others. The folks, the AOL crowd, that group of folks that everyone knows that are fairly connected in town. So the assumption that a lot of people made was, well, you got those guys' money, you don't need anything of mine. And I know for a fact that there are some of these folks that are philanthropists are not writing the big checks to every organization. And I know a couple of them loved the organization, were involved with the students in this one particular, on a daily basis, mentoring on a daily basis, but didn't write a substantial check. And that ended up being one of the things that put them out of business. So you don't need to go for the top, you need to think of growing the organization, growing the board as the organization grows, and look for people within a group that you work. Like Marriott, for example, is someone who supported DC Central Kitchen. Well, Mr. Marriott, the Marriott family is not going to be on our board. I wouldn't want them to be on our board, but someone who's involved in volunteerism at Marriott or is in the workforce development side of Marriott would be very helpful to us, and an opportunity for them to develop their career. So it's a really good mutual relationship. And that has helped us get to this place where we are over 50% people of color and significantly more women. And then also making sure that we're committed to having the voice of our students, the individuals that we work with, on the board as well.
That's great. It's a good example. And, you know, for for you, I think a lot of it comes for you, and some of the leaders on the board may help too. And I think for some groups that are more, you know, the membership-based organizations, those that may represent a profession or a trade association, I think the work has been centralized, and the trend has been to bring more of that work to a leadership development committee or a nominating committee. You know, the old way, you know, my perspective working with a lot of membership organizations, the old way is, okay, anyone who wants to be a board member, submit your form with your proof of your, you know, sort of your background and things like that. And you know, maybe there's a slight amount of vetting from a nominating committee, but some groups would even have, you know, the contested seats. You would be able to vote for one person. There's two people running for each seat, each vacancy. And you know, in the old days when you had a lot of membership participation and you know, some interest in being part of the governance from the membership, maybe that worked, but now that sort of approach has really sort of resulted in a lot of the same old names and recognizable people who go in, throw their name in the ring, or their name in the hat, hat in the ring. Anyway, we've worked very closely with some associations very recently to move to a much more intentional process to identify who gets on a slate and who gets elected to the board of that organization. I mean, the reality is, for the membership organizations, of those of you who represent or work with membership organizations know this, members aren't voting anymore. I mean, this whole notion of a membership vote, we're getting like 4%, 5% participation, and heaven forbid that they didn't have the right quorum provision in their bylaws, because they could have situations where they have to keep bugging their members to reach that quorum. So, you know, whoever gets voted in through the membership process, it's rarely a true, you know, indication of who is the best qualified candidate for that particular position. So what we've seen a definite trend in is, you know, making sure it's consistent with your statute and your bylaws, and you may have to amend your bylaws to do that, but have the Leadership Development Committee really be a strong sort of research body almost, to make sure that you have the truly representative group of people that you want to place before. And if it does have to do a membership vote, what's happening more and more now is, here's the slate. If you want to contest it, you know, get X% of your members to petition us. And, you know, it's possible, it's technically democratic, but really you create a hurdle from that. And so it really becomes more power with the Leadership Development Committee. So that's something that we're seeing more of. Okay, another sort of pointer that this one does come from the old slides too, and I think it hasn't changed very much. But I mean, when you're working with boards, you know, Mike talked about even that trust level with your chair. I think that's still there, and the trust level also needs to be there with the full board. Where I've seen, you know, things go afoul and problems arise with the CEO board relationship, it's very often with surprises and with the board saying, well, that's the first time I'm hearing that. And it's, you know, in the third quarter, the forecast has gone from a $1 million surplus to a $2 million deficit or something like that. You know, you know, with this bad, they say bad news doesn't age well. You know, it's very important to make sure that as a leader of the organization, you're keeping the board apprised early on. And it's best to come in. This is from my perspective of seeing, you know, good professionals do this. It's best to come in with a solution then too, and say, okay, well, here's what we're doing to fix it.
Or information. So I'll tell you, we're going to have a conversation with the board next Tuesday. Charity Navigator, in all of its wisdom, has redefined now how they're ranking or scoring organizations. And we learned that it's sort of basically, if you click on a button that you can either be a food organization or a training organization, but you can't be both. And so either way that we go, we're only getting credit, if you will, for half of the work that we do. So there's a very good chance that we're going to lose one of our stars. And I think a lot of that stuff's going by the wayside, so I don't really care a whole lot. But that could be something that a board member would see And I don't know when this is going to come out. I didn't even know if we're going to lose a star, to be honest with you. I think probably we will, but we're going to talk about it and say, hey, this is the new methodology they're using. This is the process that we went through. This is our response to them and their response to us in this discussion. And just so you know, I always say, I say this to our staff as well, like if someone comes up to me and on the street or someone I know says, hey, I saw you guys are doing this and I don't know about it, that's going to be a problem for me. I look like an idiot. I don't like looking like an idiot. And I don't want our board members to feel that same way either. They're like, oh, I was looking at Charity Navigator, DC Central Kitchen, lost a star. That would be an awkward position. But now we've armed them with the material. Say, well, actually, you know, it's a bit of a flawed system. And yeah, we did discuss it and we're still doing all the work. Actually, we're doing more, but this is the way that it's being looked at. So that was just a tip right now. And someone on the staff said, maybe we don't need to talk about it because we don't even know. Like, but why not? You know, it doesn't hurt us. And I'd rather just be upfront about it anyway.
That's a good example. Okay. Choose your battles. This is, again, you know, more from the perspective of the executive who has to deal with the board. But, you know, we do sit in on a lot of board meetings, and I know there are, you can never, no matter how good you train board members, no matter, you know, how much your board expectations document tells them what this is what we should be discussing and not, there usually will be at least one or two board members who wants to get in the weeds and those discussions that we talked about. And I think that there's, you know, those that I've seen do this effectively in Mike's seat, and he's no exception to this either. You know, there's a certain amount that you just tolerate and that you allow to go through because, you know, you only have, you know, so much time to worry about those sorts of things. And sometimes if you are tolerant, if you do have a good connection with your chair and advance buy-in, you may have the board chair actually be the one to say, hey, this is not what we're talking about. Let's stick to the agenda. A well-crafted agenda helps with that a lot, sticking to discussion times too, and keeping your chair on board with that.
So this is a good example of things that I might do better in my professional life than I do in my personal and family life. And because I've had conversations with my wife before, she'll say something effective like, do you want to fight or do you want to win? Like, so this is, yeah, there are times, as George, you could conflict with the chair or certain members of the board, but does it really matter? And ultimately, at the end of the day, where do you want to go? So what's that last page of flip chart that you ultimately want to be? You know, where do you want to land? And if you focus on getting there, you can give a little here and there. And if people feel better about that input, and everyone should have that input. But there are times when it isn't worth it. It just simply isn't.
So there are times where you do have to have that draw the line backbone. Right. And from my perspective, a lot of it's legal issues. If there's someone who's trying to tell you that their relationship that they have with some outside company, providers, family member, whatever it might be, isn't going to implicate a conflict, even though it's obvious that it would. I mean, it's great if you have your board chairs, you know, sort of, you know, taking the lead on this, but even if you don't, you just have to draw the line and say, no, we have a policy in place. We have to, you know, address whether you recuse yourself and those sorts of things. And often in the association world, antitrust, I mean, you know, you're not always going to have a lawyer in the room when some discussions may happen that may involve price or price related items or things like that. And you as a CEO, that's a behavioral issue you just have to stop, because that's a criminal statute. Not that you know, you're immediately going to jail if the discussion happens, but it's serious stuff. Anything contrary to exempt status, it's really important to keep people understanding their guardrails. And then, you know, I think, you know, another thing that I've seen where things have gone awry with the board staff relationship is where, you know, it's discussions that don't happen with the full board, and it's discussions that happen in sort of side groups and, you know, I sort of splinter groups and whispers. And
something to say that George said there isn't always a lawyer in the room, as if that's a bad thing, I guess. So I think there are two ways to look at that. So we've had attorneys on our board before who are just who are not our attorneys. George and his colleagues are our attorneys, but we've had other attorneys on our board who feel that they should be our attorneys as well and not board members. And so we've pretty much sworn off attorneys as board members and are relying on our legal counsel for that kind of guidance, which is, again, everyone needs to stay in their lane and understand their roles. They're there as a board member, not as a legal advisor, and their area of their specialty is not nonprofit law like George and his colleagues that advise us.
Good point. All right, just two more real quick, and we're about at time. talked a little bit about this. Look, to really achieve the goal of a more representative board, it's all about developing individuals to step in. You know, having term limits in place is something that funders are asking about. You know, do you have term limits and what are they like? I would say sort of the usual that we see is maybe you know, 2-3 year terms, and then you got to at least take a year off or something like that. But that obviously means you've got to have new people coming in on a regular basis. And so we talked about the committees and task forces and identifying people through other volunteer opportunities. But the one thing I would say, and I think Mike would probably agree, you know, shouldn't limit yourself to those who have sort of gone through the farm system, gone through the committee route and those sorts of things, because there may be people who just are perfect otherwise, are just not as aware of the organization. So you may have to do some pulling of people as opposed to just entertaining people who are sort of vying for the position.
What I'm finding is you could think about developing the board the way you're thinking about developing your own leaders. And those are younger folks and giving those career development opportunities to that group. And I'm finding a lot of the really good board recommendations I'm getting now are from our managers, directors, so the younger part of the C-suite group, because they're out in the community creating partnerships and networks, and they really have, they're in tune with the evolution of the sector in ways that I'm not right now, perhaps. And so really looking to that younger or rising leader group to be the future as both internally and on your board, I think that has really helped us over the last few years get to a place where I think we're really comfortable and representative of where we are in this community.
Great. So lastly, and this is a real important one, and I think this is something that Mike does well, and a lot of our association, other nonprofit clients also do very well, is you don't compensate. Well, the vast majority of nonprofits do not compensate their directors in any way, shape, or form when it comes to financial compensation. They're volunteer roles, but there are benefits you can give to your board members, and you should pay close attention to making sure that where you can give those benefits, you do. A lot of times, while they may all be doing this for all good motive, I think everyone appreciates some recognition, visibility, and exposure, at events and activities, and to give them that those sorts of chances to shine, or put the spotlight on them is real important to have them have a good feeling about their role on the board. I don't know if there's anything in particular
Sure.
that you.
Yeah, well, we do try to include board members in events, always call people out, whether it's a graduation or one of our larger, more public-facing events, and invite board members to be part of smaller internal events, whether the cook-offs with our students, graduations, those kind of things. We actually, at every board meeting, the chair starts with her comments, and then we have a section called Board Kudos. And it's where we actually, over the last quarter, we call out and you have pictures, if we can, of what board members have done that have been particularly helpful. Now, the irony here, and this is sort of a dirty little secret, is I started doing that to embarrass members who were doing nothing. So it was as much a sort of a, I don't know, negative, not the carrot, more of the stick situation. But it was seen more as the carrot.
I distinctly remember being in one meeting where one board member said, "I did this." You didn't put it on. He was ticked off that you didn't include
You forgot me.
Right.
And so that's something we go over when we're preparing our board materials. Now, make sure, do we get all the kudos? Do we get all the kudos? And it's fun to see people try to do that. So that is just a little way. It's mostly internal, but we're very, we have to do a lot of social media stuff, and whenever we can, we're including people there as well.
Well, that's it. We're a little bit over time, not a lot.
But we started late.
Yeah, we started late. So that's just our presentation for the day. Really appreciate your time and attention. And those of you here in person, look forward to chatting more out in the hallway. So thanks, Mike. Please join me in thanking Mike and coming here and sharing his experience.
Thank you.
That was great. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.